Mention the word alchemy and you tend to conjure up images of bearded men tending roaring furnaces in the Middle Ages. Their aim to turn base metals like lead or tin into something much more valuable, glittering gold. Did any of them actually succeed in this apparently ludicrous enterprise? Well, there were literally thousands of them working across Europe during the Middle Ages, and at one point the city of Prague had 10,000 alone. Many, of course, were charlatans, and a tiny proportion, a fraction of 1%, possibly succeeded in transmuting base metals into gold, and some of these accounts are surprisingly well authenticated. But alchemy isn't just frothy medieval nonsense. I'd argue that it's actually central to humanity's evolution at the moment. Alchemy, the process of relentless change and transformation, is what we and the universe are all about. There is nothing at all in the universe that's not in a constant state of change. Our bodies renew their cells every 7 years, and in the case of our skin, sometimes it's every 2 or 3 days. Alchemy happens naturally in the earth. Trees decay, and over a period of millions and millions of years they turn into graphite, into coal, into jet, and even into diamonds. 90 years ago, the British scientist Ernest Rutherford became the first scientist ever to transform one element into another, when he briefly converted nitrogen into oxygen in the laboratory. You could say, I suppose, that science's ultimate alchemical adventure was the nuclear bomb. Alchemy is often described as the Hermetic art, and it's named after a mysterious and possibly mythical figure called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. He wrote one of alchemy's most famous texts, the Emerald Tablet, as well as dozens of other books on alchemy and other subjects. The most famous thing that you read in the Emerald Tablet is the axiom, as above, so below, as below, so above. This means that everything mirrors everything else. It means that man, the microcosm, mirrors the universe, the macrocosm. Alchemy derives its name from al-Khaim or alchimia. Khaim is the old name for Egypt, and it can refer either to the dark, fertile silt which lines the River Nile, or more metaphysically, it can refer to the darkness and blackness of ignorance. Alchemy is sometimes called the royal or noble art. It's the science of manipulating life and consciousness. Learn its secrets and you can shoehorn millions of years of evolution into a few hours, days, or weeks. The co-founder of the Theosophical Society, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, sparked off an alchemical revolution in the last quarter of the 19th century. She described alchemy as magnetic magic, and she said it had the power not only to transmute matter, but also the human spirit. And she said there was another purpose too, to achieve the conscious immortality of that spirit. Now, of course, alchemy, which forms the basis of modern chemistry, is much more than about mere metallurgy. The more venal of the alchemists, of course, were just interested in turning lead into gold ingots once they discovered the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone, normally a reddish substance, was the powder of projection which actually transmuted lead into gold or into some other precious metal. Persecuted by the Catholic Church and constantly hounded by greedy monarchs anxious to replenish their empty coffers, the alchemists worked in great secrecy. The writings were often incomprehensible gibberish, and they hid a lot of their work behind very complicated symbols: hermaphrodites, peacocks, birds, kings and queens, and the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. But as well as guarding against the church and the state, the alchemists also had to guard against someone else. They had to be careful not to let their secrets fall into the hands of profane people who would use these things for selfish or materialistic ends. For many alchemists, gold making was just a sideshow. It was a blind to disguise what they were really up to. The true adepts were more interested in alchemy's life-enhancing possibilities, both physically and spiritually. There were famous proponents like Paracelsus, who's sometimes called the Luther of medicine, and he actually manufactured medicines made from oils of gold. So increasingly the bubbling crucibles became a metaphor for the spiritual transformation of the alchemists themselves. I'm sure there are still a few practical alchemists working around the world, but these days the emphasis has gone from operative alchemy to speculative alchemy, whereby the individual tries to perfect themselves spiritually rather than producing gold. Over the centuries, many occultists have suggested that the actual transmutation of the metals takes place on a non-physical plane of reality, sometimes referred to as possibly the astral plane. Recent experiments using the 7 noble metals, which include gold, platinum, rhodium, ruthenium, palladium, etc., have shown some truly remarkable properties. If you subject these metals to prolonged heating, astonishing things actually start to happen. Now, gold melts at 1064 degrees centigrade. When they test it, they normally just melt it for a few seconds. If you take a tiny sliver of gold and subject it to 300 seconds of intense heat, that's 5 minutes, very unusual things start to happen indeed. The gold is reduced to a mass of white powder. A tiny sliver of gold produces a large mound of this white powder. The gold has now been reduced to what's known as an orbitally realigned monatomic element, an orm. When you weigh this powder, it weighs only 5/9 of the original weight. At some points in the heating and cooling process, the weight of that powder actually becomes less than 0, suggesting it has anti-gravitational or even levitational effects. Just think of the possibilities there. At some points in the process, even more mysteriously, the white powder vanishes altogether. When one of the scientists took a spatula and poked it where the white powder should be, what do you think happened when the powder reappeared? It was there in a pristine heap. There were no signs of where the spatula had been. The white powder had been somewhere else entirely. It's widely believed that these monatomic elements could have a huge impact on all sorts of different areas of human endeavour: space travel, clean fuel cells, new medical technologies. Early experiments have actually shown that monatomic elements could make great inroads into curing diseases like AIDS and cancer. The belief is that these elements somehow resonate with our DNA, and after all, cancer is only DNA in a model. So rather than having to resort to the traditional means of crudely killing off those cancers with chemotherapy, radiotherapy or surgery, you use the monatomic elements to cure the model. Monatomic elements are what's known as exotic matter. They don't behave in the way that normal elements do, but they do offer a much more benign and less violent treatment of disease. As you might expect, science has largely ignored these things as it's ignored them down the decades and the centuries. There are also many vested interests in medicine, in the pharmaceutical companies, in the oil companies, who would not want these secrets to come out. So, the story of alchemy has been unfolding for millennia. It's vanished from view, it's reappeared, but someone somewhere has always been keeping it alive. It's my belief now that alchemy offers the most exciting means of transforming human life that we've ever known.